And he goes into the synagogue again, and there was a man there which had a withered hand. Luke, being the doctor, mentions it's the right hand. Is there any significance in that?
Quite possibly, because the right hand is the clean hand, as opposed to the left hand being the unclean hand. You've also got the right hand of God, so it's the power and the authority. So maybe there is something about the power and authority which is being spoken that links into the right hand as well.
So that's setting up the scene. Wonderfully concise writing here. Mark says, and they watched him, whether he would heal him on the Sabbath day, that they might accuse him. And was this man with the withered hand a plant?
Yeah, was he? That term, and they watched him, as it's translated in the King James, is quite emotive because it carries sort of negative connotations with it. And it means that they were watching him out the corner of their eye, or they were spying on him. Quite feasibly, this is a bit of a stitch-up job. And also, this is now the third time in our reading that Jesus is doing something on the Sabbath.
It is the third Sabbath controversy.
Yeah, that's right. Mark 1:23, we've got that unclean spirit in the synagogue, and then in Mark 2:23, we've got the grain of fields on the Sabbath. Now in Mark 3:1, we've also got the man with this withered hand in the synagogue. Again, you're looking at a triad. You have a trinity, and you have the right hand, and you have power, and you have authority. So there's all these lovely little weaves going on in the background, which you can discern some of the colour of, I think.
And in oral tradition, of course, 3 is a very important thing. If you hear something 3 times or repeat it as theme, then it's important.
Yep.
So, do you think he was a plant?
It's not beyond the bounds of possibility that he was, and it wouldn't surprise me. What suggests to me that he could have been is the fact that they watched him. It's the way that that word is used. They watched him, meaning that they were spying on him. And if he wasn't a plant, they knew he would be there, and therefore it would have given the Pharisees the opportunity to critique Jesus for doing something because they knew this dude was there. So even if he wasn't planted specifically by them, they knew that he was there, and they had their beady little eyes on Jesus as to what he was looking to try and do or what he might do.
We know from reading chapter 2 that Jesus, he's not going to accept necessarily Pharisaic authority.
No.
And what happens next is it's like a novel now, because Jesus saith unto the man with the withered hand, stand forth. Just 2 words. I don't think he would have shouted it or barked it. It was very softly spoken, I can imagine. But you could read it as an imperative. Stand forth. In the military, we'd be up, yes sir, how high? And then he saith unto them, at the same time, he was looking towards the Pharisees, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath days, or to do evil, to save life, or to kill? But of course they held their peace.
Mark 3:1, the man with this withered hand in the synagogue.
Is he using the kol vachomer from the small to the great?
You weigh something. This is a small thing, this is a greater thing. If this is a lesser thing, this is a bigger thing. So it's, valkahomer. It's a traditional rabbinical way of juxtaposing things so that you go, this is a tiny thing and this is a much greater thing. So the gravity of this thing far outweighs this thing. This is a lesser aspect of the law. This is a heftier, this is a more weighty aspect of the law. So yes, I do suspect that that is the type of rabbinical methodology that he's deploying as he's speaking like this. He's also actually putting something out there which is quite interesting. We've talked about this being on the Sabbath, and there was the view that only if life was in danger could one attempt to heal on the Sabbath. There's a piece in, I think it's in the Mishnah, that says, they do not straighten the limb of a child or set a broken limb. He whose hand or foot was dislocated should not pour cold water over them, but he washes in the usual way, and if he is healed, he is healed. So the Pharisees prohibited doing anything, straightening of a limb, anything on the Sabbath. Clearly, the situation that we're faced with here, life isn't endangered at all. And they draw this from the book of Exodus 31 verses 14 through to 17. It's about how the Sabbath is a holy day, and that if you work on it, you'll be likely to be put to death and you'll be cut off from your people. God worked for 6 days, but on the 7th, God rested, and so you should rest as well. Going back to the point you made about the command that Jesus says, he said to the man, stand forth. So quite literally that means stand up in the middle.
Yes.
And so most synagogues were arranged with like benches along the walls, and they had this open space in the centre for seating on the floor. And so he's basically called this man, wherever he was, let's just for artistic license say he was hidden in the corner. Jesus doesn't do anything in secret. He calls this dude out from wherever he was, right smack bang into the centre. So there's no need now for the Pharisees to spy on him or watch him closely to see if he sneaks up alongside him and does a magic touch on him and make him better. He actually calls the dude right into the spotlight. Get out there, right in the middle. And once this man's in the spotlight, he then turns, in verse 4, to the Pharisees. So, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil? In that Valkahoma, the lesser the greater. Is it lawful to save life or kill? Well, they know it's lawful to save life because that's what the Mishnah and their tradition says. But they're left in this, well, what's the greater thing? The best thing is obviously to save life. The worst thing is to kill. The best thing is to do good. The worst thing is to do bad. So therefore, I think he's set them up quite nicely.
Yeah, because works of necessity and mercy, as Fruchtenbaum says, were allowed on the Sabbath.
Yeah.
And that would include healing as an act of mercy. Were allowed on the Sabbath.
Yeah.
Now, they must have known this.
Yeah. And so what do? They held their
peace. Yeah.
Because by saying, well, of course it's better to do good, they're now giving him the green light to go and do good. And they don't want to do that. By healing the man, Jesus was going to do good. Whereas the Pharisees, by doing evil on the Sabbath, were trying to trap him. So they were actually the ones doing evil.
Yes. What's also interesting is that when you read it, and when he, Jesus, had looked around about on them with anger, being grieved for the hardness of their hearts, he saith unto the man, stretch forth thine hand. Interesting anger, because we are aware of righteous anger. I'm not sure of the original word, whether that's been translated with a slightly harsher tone than it was in the original.
It's quite sort of a complex verse, this, to be quite honest with you. So Jesus' response, the Greek term is orge, which is passionate, impulsive expression of intense emotion. So that's what he does. When that type of word is associated with God, that emotion is almost always God's wrath in response to sin. But then Jesus' compassion for the disabled man prompts this protective anger at those who deny him help. So he had this wrath towards sin, grieved for the hardness of their hearts. But he then says to the man, he has sorrow for him. He was grieved for him. Greek word is something like silepo, I think, from memory. He felt sympathy for him, which is the first and the only time, actually, that's used in the New Testament, that he had this sympathy for him. So it's quite significant. And he grieved because of the hardness of heart.
We're getting a very nuanced look at how Jesus is reacting here.
Yeah.
To those of the Pharisees, he is angered, as you described it, almost like a piqued feeling. But at the very same time, and this is the difference, most people just go into pure anger in any one moment, or they go into pure grieving, not both at the same time. You can do it possibly, but he's showing a real nuance of feeling here. It's amazing how Mark has written this, because he could just very easily have said, out of spite, so that would have given a wrong impression, or just anger. Again, it's the softening afterwards with grieving that you could very easily overlook in just a quick reading, couldn't you?
Oh, absolutely. This is important to note as well. He grieved for the hardness of their hearts. Who is the there? The Pharisees. While he was completely sympathetic towards the man who he's about to restore, he was also absolutely mortified, gutted by the hardness of the heart of these Pharisees. In the first century there, when we said that somebody had a hard heart, it didn't mean that they were cruel or that they were unkind or rather anything like that. It's that their reasons, that their emotions, their what we would probably call EQ,
emotion quotient,
was no longer able to be developed. They had become resistant to developing their EQ. They had reached a pinnacle, and that was that. And Jesus is like, oh man, this is a nightmare, you lot. You're supposed to be better than that. You're spiritually blind. You are the blind leading the blind, just groping around. And so he felt really sorry for them. Deep anguish for the Pharisees. Why did he feel such anguish? I think it's because leaders of the faith will get a double whammy.
Right.
James talks about this, saying not many of you should be teachers because you'll get a double judgment. You'll get a much more severe judgment on you for being a teacher of the faith. And I think that Jesus, with his prescient view of the world, was looking at these guys thinking, you've got no idea what you are about to let yourself in for by being so emotionally squashed, by refusing to develop your thinking, and you are heading down a very dark road. He was incredibly gracious towards them, I think.
Because then what happens? He says unto the man with the withered hand, stretch forth thine hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored whole as the other. Instant, by word, not asking about faith. Just did it.
Yeah.
That would have caused a few ripples.
Wouldn't it just? He didn't say, I heal your hand. He just said, stretch your hand out. He just had to obey. All he had to do was follow the command of Jesus. That was it. He says, you do it, job done.
Directly afterwards, we know in verse 6, the Pharisees went forth and straightway took counsel with the Herodians against him, that is Jesus, how they might destroy him. Now, I'm focusing on the people in the synagogue, the ones who weren't with the Pharisees. I think by this stage, if it hadn't already sunk in, because some people may have been there for the first time, that there's now incontrovertible proof of this guy, Jesus, that even if they've heard rumour or they've heard about him, if they were there, it's like, ooh, judging by the fact that the Pharisees would have scarpered off, the die's been cast.
Yeah, you're going to have people who would have been looking at this and listening in on these comments. So this conversation was not taking place in a vacuum. It's right in the middle of the synagogue. You had to have a minimum of 10 people in there. Probably this was the synagogue in Capernaum, so it would have been a relatively well-attended synagogue from that area. And you've got them all watching this going on. It's almost like if you were filming this, you'd have like a bit of a buzz going through the crowd. You'd see Jesus rock up there. You'd see the Pharisees and legal experts and all the other folk hanging around the corners. You'd see the man with a withered hand curled up in the corner or sat out the way in the shadows. And we know what's going to happen here. They're going to stitch him up. And Jesus calls the dude out into the centre, sticks him under the spotlight. Everything hushes. It all goes quiet. And Jesus sort of starts to set the scene, set the pace, set the narrative. And then before Jesus calls this man to put his hand forth, you've probably got people thinking, oh, I wonder how he's going to do it. I wonder what he's going to do. I wonder what's going to happen. I wonder how it's going to work. And sure enough, he doesn't do anything. He just says, stick your hand out. There's no work. So there's no breaking of the Mosaic law.
Yes.
He just speaks. There is absolutely no labour. Jesus spoke and his word brought everything into alignment. Now think about the beginning of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.
Yeah.
He spoke and everything came into alignment. He didn't have to do anything. He just spoke. His word went forth. And I would imagine that there would have been people sat there going, you what? How on earth did that happen?
We know what the response was because straight afterwards, Jesus withdrew himself and crowds from everywhere flocked. They got to hear of this. Yet the Pharisees, skittling off towards the Herodian camp, who were very pro-Roman, you could not get a more diametrically opposed after effect here. Yet the people who were supposed to be the spiritual guardians were the ones that don't get it.
And we see this in politics today. This is where your hatred of something or someone can blind you to everything else.
Yes.
And nothing has changed. The Pharisees' hatred of Jesus and what he stood for blinded them to the incredible miracle that they had just seen. And even if they objected to what he had done, it would become incredibly difficult for them to argue that Jesus wasn't somebody that God was using, at the very least. Because would God exercise his power through Jesus if Jesus was doing something wrong, or if Jesus was just a whack job lunatic on the fringes? No, he wouldn't. And they knew that, so it put them in a very uncomfortable position. These guys were so wrapped up in their self-righteous indignation that this carpenter from Nazareth, this strange, unlearned man, could suddenly appear on the scene, doing these miraculous things, speaking like he was a rabbi with authority, a rabbi with smicha. They couldn't get their head around it, and better to just shut him down and hate.
And as you say, it happens all the time. It's happened throughout history. Towards the end of this, they went straight away, took counsel, this is the Pharisees with the Herodians, against him, Jesus, how they might destroy him. If I'm correct, this is the first time we've come across the Herodians.
Yes, they're only actually mentioned in the New Testament once in Matthew, twice in Mark. So I think only 3 times they're actually brought up. And it's the first time, certainly in Mark. We meet them again later in chapter 12. We'll probably get there in about 2037. So and that's not chapter 20 and verse 37.
Timing, Steve. Divine
it's about
timing.
2037 that we'll get there. There are some manuscripts that also read in Mark 8 where it says Herod. Some manuscripts put Herodians in there as well.
So why go to them? Now, obviously, the Romans were on the scene, or coming ever increasingly. They tended to be out towards the coast, Caesarea. They don't feel they can deal with Jesus on their own.
Perhaps as well a reflection on how they saw Jesus as a threat to the political establishment. The Jewish people had a right to worship their God. They were given certain exemptions. They were allowed to do certain things. They weren't expected to pinch the incense to Caesar as long as they kept everybody in check. So as long as they didn't do anything stupid, and the Pharisees would know this, and the Pharisees, obviously they had the power, they had the authority and all the rest of it. I wonder whether or not the Herodians, who were not a religious group at all, they were more politically aligned as supporters of Herod's reign and Herod's overarching control. So I suspect that they were possibly a bit concerned that this Jesus of Nazareth could upset the political balance. And if he could upset the political balance, then there would be a number of people that would be in the bullseye for that. One would be the Herodians, one would be the Pharisees. And so they come together because the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so I think that they've suddenly find that they've got a common ground in terms of maintaining the status quo with Rome and also ensuring that Herod's rule isn't mucked up in any way, shape or form. So they are unlikely bedfellows, but bedfellows they are. And that is strange, but not surprising.
Needs must. They see Jesus as the greater threat because he's undermining their own status when it comes to the law.
Yeah.
The Sadducees are always the enigma here. We know they're there. They aren't necessarily mentioned here, though.
Pharisees are very different from the Sadducees, drawn from a very different line, and the Sadducees are much quieter in certain areas. I think the Pharisees are the ones that come to the fore in the vast majority of the time because they are the ones that Jesus agrees with most, to be quite honest. The Sadducees were a group who had got long established genealogical privileges and prerogatives that had flowed all the way
from... they were the aristocrats.
Yeah, they were. They were like the elite, and the Pharisees were more like the common man, but zapped up a bit with the institution of Torah and all the rest of it. They were less of an elite group than the Sadducees. But they were a very large group. They were connected across the broad swathe of Judaism at the time, very influential. In fact, it was only the Christians and the Pharisees that survived the war with Rome.
The Sadducees were very centred on the temple.
Yes.
They're not mentioned now because we haven't got there yet. I wouldn't be surprised if the Sadducees looked at what was happening over in the Sea of Galilee and thought, well, that's a provincial concern. Let the Pharisees deal with that one.
Let the forbidden carrot crunchers sort it out. It's not going to affect us in the great metropolis of
the fig
Jerusalem.
Eaters,
yeah. The carrot crunchers can just crack on with it, and we'll worry about that when we have to worry about it. I don't think Jesus was seen as a threat to the Sadducees at that time. The Herodians are always linked with the Pharisees. They're never linked with the Sadducees. And so that probably reflects like the agreement regarding political objectives. So nationalism as opposed to submission to the yoke of Roman oppression rather than philosophy or religious beliefs.
The Pharisees, we know that they were popular. They were a popular movement. They came from all over, and they therefore were different people from different runs of life. And they were kind of a cross-section of society, very much into what they considered righteous behaviour. They're the ones that Jesus would be the closest he would have agreed with. That's half the problem, isn't it? They're so closely aligned, it's almost like trying to tell the difference between two enemies that became allies in a war. It's like, hang on, why so much vehemence?
The caricature, if you like, of the Pharisees is that they were guardians of religiosity. They were guardians of the rules, they were guardians of the regulations. If you referred to somebody as a Pharisee, it was generally not a kind thing. They were often seen as hypocritical or self-righteous or zealous or something like that. And Jesus' engagement was much more nuanced than that. And what he did was he pulled them up, not for being Pharisees, he pulled them up for being blinkered. You'll apply the letter of the law, but what about the spirit of it? These weren't bad people. What he's trying to do is to get them to actually be a bit more liberal. So at the time of Jesus, there were two main schools. There was a school of Shammai and the school of Hillel. And Shammai was much, much stricter. And Hillel was much more liberal in terms of back then, not liberal in our understanding of liberal, but in terms back then, in their sort of temporal reality, it was much more liberal. And 8 occasions where Jesus is having engagements, he aligns himself on 7 of those occasions with the school of Hillel, which is the liberal school, and only once with the school of Shammai, which is the much more rigid, zealous one. And that's about marriage and adultery. So Jesus' whole approach was not pushing the purity theme for national Israel, which is what the Pharisees were doing, i.e. the Perashim, meaning they were the ones that were set apart. That's where we get the word Pharisee from, that they're set apart. Jesus is saying, no, you don't need to be set apart as a Pharisee. What you need to be is salt and light. You need to shine the light into darkness. You need to be the seasoning and the flavouring that goes onto the food. Be salt and light into the world. So his whole approach was slightly different. His engagement with the Pharisees was generally very similar to the Pharisaical approach.
Blinkered.
Yeah.
Short-sighted. They know the letter of the law, but they don't know the spirit of the law. When you consider the Colosseum, it used to be that the audience were pointing and laughing at the Christians, but now the Christians are in the audience often, laughing and pointing at refugees, or something like that. Blinkered, short-sighted, letter of the law, not the spirit of the law.
There are many Christian denominations, many Christian leaders who will stand in judgment on Scripture rather than sit in humility under Scripture. And I think that we need to get it the other way around. We need to sit in humility under Scripture. And that means that the way that we present ourselves needs to be much more Christ-like. And being Christ-like means cutting some slack, showing some grace. A woman that's been dragged in front of him, probably stark naked, having just been pulled off the job, is thrown there in front of him, and they say, she's been caught in the act. Now we dragged her in front of you, Rabbi. The law says we should stone her to death.
Yeah, let him who is without sin cast the first stone.
Let him who is without sin cast the first stone. Standing in judgment on Scripture is not our place. We sit in humility under it. We have a God who will judge. His name is Jesus. And at the end of time, every single knee will bow to him. All judgment belongs to the Son. We need to be much more mindful of how we respond, how we react. Now, that doesn't negate the fact that we're human beings and we will act as human beings act. We've got our prejudices, we've got our discriminations, we've got all of those flaws in our character. For whatever reason, we've got those things. But we need to consistently work on how we view stuff. One of the things that I said on Sunday was that there are some people that I just don't like.
Controlling your emotions.
Yeah, I don't warm to them, I don't like them. When that happens to me, rather than me just trying to shut down and go, I can't be bothered with you, I pray and I'm saying, Jesus, let me see this person, this man, this woman, through your eyes. Let me see them as you see them, because the way I see them is probably not the right way. And let me show you your compassion to them. Jesus was no pushover. Never mistake kindness for weakness.
Oh, absolutely. I was reading also, and you'll know my own personal love of books.
Yeah, a little bit.
There's 2 books here, tell us everything we need to know. Not equally. The complete works of William Shakespeare, because he was able to give the masculine and the feminine and all our inner thoughts and grievances, and it's still relevant today. And it's the same with the Bible. It's amazing that you could read what we just read. The way it's even written, it's so modern, so fresh. It's as though it's happening in front of you, but we still need to be reminded of it every single day. Just wonderful to read, isn't it?
It is, absolutely. Nothing changes in humanity, as we have said time and time again in our conversations. Politics, political leaders come, go, they go round and round. The truth that's contained within the covers of this book are absolutely timeless.